This episode was suggested by a listener, Heather T., on Facebook. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Twitter @MorbidPodcast, on our Facebook page and Instagram @MorbidCuriosityPodcast, or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Many times, when listeners make topic suggestions, being morbidly curious myself, I've heard a little bit about the topic. In the case of today's episode, I hadn't heard anything about this specific place. As I dug deeper, peeling back the layers of rumor and hearsay, the actual story of this place was quite different from what I was expecting. It was a very interesting and enjoyable journey, and I hope you enjoy it too. There are many places known as the most haunted place on Earth. The most haunted road, the most haunted castle, the most haunted prison. Poveglia, a small island in a shallow lagoon near Venice, Italy, is said to be the most haunted island in the world, thanks to the grisly events that occurred there over the years. It's said to have been a plague hospital, a military outpost, and later a psychiatric hospital. Website after website claims that local Venetians won't go near the island because it's haunted by the people who died of plague there. They also say the island's soil is made up of more than 50% human ashes, thanks to the large pyres used to burn the victims of plague. It is said that between 100 and 160,000 people died and were burned there. It's also said that later, the island was reconstructed into a psychiatric hospital, where a doctor experimented with lobotomy on his patients, torturing and murdering them in order to find out how the human brain worked. It's said he finally went mad himself and leapt to his death from the top of the lighthouse, or possibly that some of his patients took revenge and pushed him. These are the stories that are told about Poveglia, but is there any truth to them? Venice happens to be home to one of the largest collections of historical written documents, therefore much of its history is well preserved. This includes the history of Poveglia, and it seems that the stories about this infamous island do have some base in truth. But first, a little more about Venice, the lagoon it sits in, and their part in Poveglia's history. Venice is known best for being a floating city, a city of romance and mystery. Venice is spread across 118 islands, separated by shallow canals and linked by around 400 bridges. These islands are located in what is called the Venetian Lagoon, a bay that sits between the Brenta and Sile rivers. Several other islands, 31 to be exact, also lay in this lagoon, and the whole wetland is connected to the Adriatic Sea by 3 inlets, Lido, Malamocco, and Chioggia. Many of the islands have remained autonomous from Venice until recent history. Located southeast of Venice along the coast of Lido, Poveglia is one of these many islands and currently part of the province of Venice. The whole area is documented as being occupied since the 4th century CE by people under the jurisdiction of Rome. The Romans recorded that these people found refuge on Poveglia while fleeing invasions from Germanic tribes and the Huns. Venice was one of the first major international financial and cultural centers from the 9th to the 14th century CE. It was its own city-state, ruled by a doge, or governor, and had lengthy trade routes across Europe. It has also been considered a fairly wealthy city for most of its history. It's thought by historians to have been the center of Renaissance culture and art. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered the city in 1797, and it passed between him and Austria for several years before becoming a part of Italy in 1866. During World War II, the city avoided heavy attack, preserving its beautiful architecture. Today, the city is still known for its art, architecture, and canals, and remains one of the top tourist locations in the world. This, however, is a double-edged sword, as the locals are being pushed out to make way for more and more expensive hotels, and oversized cruise ships in the lagoon contribute to problems with erosion and pollution. The city is slowly sinking as well, thanks to a geological process called subsidence, in which the Earth's surface shifts downward. What is less well known about Venice is that it played a huge role in the history of public health. Venice was subject to several bouts of plague over the centuries. The greatest wave of the plague, also known as the Black Death, hit Venice in 1348. This disease was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which was carried in the gut of fleas, who were in turn carried by rodents all across the trade routes of Europe, both by land and by sea. The Black Death wiped out around 1/3 of the population of Venice and about half the population of Europe. Venice was hit by another bout of plague in 1575, again in 1577, and again in 1630. It's thought that these later incidents of plague were a combination of Yersinia pestis and cholera, a serious infection of the small intestine. In an attempt to manage these waves of sickness, Venetian physicians began to take note that the disease seemed to pass amongst families or people who lived close together. They also noted that plague often traveled by ship, which was a large issue for a city that's main industry revolved around shipping and trade. Although at the time infection from bacteria was an unknown process, these physicians knew that the disease was contagious and therefore set up a waiting period for ships entering the city. During this waiting period, the crew and all the cargo they carried were isolated on their ships and observed in order to determine if they carried any contagions. As this waiting period was around 40 days, or 40 giorni in 17th century Venetian, it became known as a quarantine, a word and process still used today to prevent the spread of disease. Most of the time, the crew and cargo stayed on their ships during this period, but in order to better determine if they were carrying plague, several islands were set up to house both people and cargo during their long waits. These were called lazzaretti, and they functioned as quarantine facilities, plague hospitals, cemeteries, and depots for disinfection and destruction of infected goods. During the heaviest waves of plague, however, they functioned as quarantine zones for the city as well as the ships. People exhibiting any symptoms of plague or symptoms of any illness were immediately removed to these islands. Physicians at these hospitals attempted to treat their patients, but most often the patients and many of the physicians died there. People died in such large numbers that cemeteries became inefficient for the number of corpses, and large pits were dug instead to inter many people at once. The first lazzaretto was Lazzaretto Vecchio, which was located on an island just north of Lido and built in 1423. During its opening years, tens of thousands of patients passed through the gates, many of which never came out. In fact, only 1/4 of the people sent to the island came back. This and the other lazzaretti were run by religious orders, usually headed by a prior. This is because caring for the dead and dying was seen as an act of charity and divine commission. Treatments were generally ineffective, and many were more harmful than helpful, but there were genuine efforts to treat those suffering from plague in these facilities. Lazzaretto Vecchio also functioned as a leprosarium at one point, a hospital for people suffering from leprosy. Archaeologists began excavations at Lazzaretto Vecchio in 2004, and since that time they have unearthed more than 1,500 skeletons of plague victims. These skeletons were found both in individual graves as well as mass graves. Thousands more are estimated to exist on the island. This estimate comes from a 16th century report that stated the death toll on Lazzaretto Vecchio reached 500 people a day at one point. As another wave of the plague ravaged the city, a second quarantine island was required, and construction on Lazzaretto Nuovo, an island just north of Sant'Erasmo Island, began in 1456 and went into operation in 1471. This facility was more specifically for those who were suspected of having the plague, such as the families of those who had already died of it in the city. This Lazzaretto and Lazzaretto Vecchio were also used as prisons on occasion, due to their isolated locations. Today, this facility has been converted into the open-air museum and includes the archaeologically preserved ruins of the buildings as well as information about the history of the plague in Venice. They also host an archaeological day camp. As the waves of plague slowed, the lazzaretti were used less and less, and soon fell into disrepair. Venice was still in need of quarantine facilities, however, and therefore Lazzaretto Nuovissimo was built on the island of Poveglia in 1808. Before it served as the third lazzaretto, Poveglia had several other purposes as well. But before we talk about the real and documented history of Poveglia, let's pause for a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. If you're too busy to sit down and read, but have time to listen, Audible.com can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep even if you cancel the service, and the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. Our other sponsor is ThinkGeek, the premier retailer for the global geek community. Express your love of Deadpool, Bob's Burgers, Doctor Who, Star Trek, and so much more with clever t-shirts and other unique apparel, home and office decor, electronics, collectibles, and more. ThinkGeek has great gifts, whether you're into science or science fiction, and many of the items on their website you won't find anywhere else. Just follow our link, bit.ly/morbidgeek, to search their massive collection. That's bit.ly/morbidgeek to get your geek on. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed and being entered in a monthly raffle. It takes a lot of time to research, write, record, and edit this show, all while keeping it free for you, the listener. When you become a patron, it helps us pay for research materials, and it keeps the lights on. If more people become patrons, we may even be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no breaks in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, head over to patreon.com/morbidcuriositypodcast. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. As I mentioned before the break, it's true that Poveglia was a lazzaretto, a quarantine facility meant to prevent outbreaks of the plague. However, at the time the lazzaretto was built on Poveglia, death and infection from the plague, while still a concern, was no longer an omnipresent threat. The more devastating pandemics had long since passed. There were 2 cases in which the island of Poveglia hosted 2 ships that carried plague, but there is no mention in the historical documents of the high number of deaths from plague that are rumored to have happened there. Writings from the time period in which the Poveglia Lazzaretto functioned speak more of the boredom of waiting to be let into Venice than the horrors of death by plague. Poveglia never saw the intensity of sickness that its predecessors did. Its main purpose was cleaning and regulating people and goods going in and out of Venice. It's likely the stories of these 3 facilities have become confused, and Poveglia takes credit for the plague deaths that actually occurred within Lazzaretto Vecchio and Lazzaretto Nuovo. The island of Poveglia served several different roles before the Lazzaretto was built. It's first mentioned as a refuge for the Roman people of Padua and Este that were fleeing from the barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th century CE. The island was transformed into a military defense against a Frankish invasion of the area in 809 and 810 CE. In the year 864, it was recorded that Poveglia, which was also known at the time as Poveglia, had become the home of the servants of the ex-doge Pietro Tardonica, the 11th doge of Venice, who had been murdered. The island prospered economically in this period, its main industries being fishing as well as salt production. By the 10th century, the island was populated by around 800 homes, and it had become famous for its fresh, healthy air and the long lives of its residents. A church of San Vitale was built, with a tall bell tower to welcome the ships that passed by the island on their way to Venice. In 1379, after the Black Death had struck Venice, a war broke out with Genoa, and several octagonal defense structures were built around the Venetian lagoon, one of which was on Poveglia. The stone platform, which now sits on the southern part of the island, only accessible by bridge, held a garrison and several cannons. The population of Poveglia was evacuated until the end of the war. Some people moved back after the war was over, as evidenced by the art and enrichment of the church of San Vitale, but sadly the island's prosperity never recovered. The size of the island also shrunk during this time, as an earthquake kick-started a major erosion problem and flooding. The island is only around 7 hectares today. The northern half, divided from the southern by a shallow canal, was built up when the mud that was excavated to build the canal was dumped there in 1808, during the time the Lazzaretto was built. The island came under the jurisdiction of the Magistrate of Public Health in 1782, which used it as a transit and control station for shipping crews and their cargo. In 1793 and 1799, ships carrying plague were quarantined there, and the island became a temporary plague hospital. A headstone from this time period was recorded on the island. In English, it roughly reads, 1793, do not dig. Those who suffered contagion in life lie here. Poveglia was made a permanent lazzaretto in 1808, following a Napoleonic edict. It was also in this year that the church tower was reconstructed into a lighthouse. The art and artifacts of the church were moved to the parish church of Malamocco. In 1814, the island was sold to the Magistrates of Maritime Sanitation, which built the structures that still exist on the island today. These buildings were meant to house sailors, passengers, and their goods while they were in quarantine. Chlorine vapors were thought to decontaminate items and people, so those on the island were often treated with these vapors. The fresh air of the island was also thought to assist with this. We now know this was ineffective as a method of decontamination. From 1831 to 1837, there was an epidemic of cholera in Venice, and the island was used as a quarantine station, similar to how Lazzaretto Vecchio and Lazzaretto Nuovo had been used during the plague, but again, to a lesser extent. Still, it was documented that between 1831 and 1832, as many as 702 ships were held up at Poveglia, and 49 of them were found to carry cholera and refused entry to the city. The crew and passengers on these ships were likely treated at Poveglia's hospital. Another incident from this time period has been documented, which is more amusing than morbid. A giraffe was sent as a gift by the Vice-King of Egypt to Emperor Francis I of Austria by ship, and that ship was detained at Poveglia on April 28, 1828. The giraffe received a lot of attention, and people from the city were even allowed to visit it during its quarantine. The giraffe was in good health and was therefore sent on to Austria. Sadly, it died not long after reaching Vienna. In the 1920s, the facilities on the island were once again utilized for another purpose when Poveglia was transformed into a place of long-term health care for the elderly poor and homeless. There was a small psychiatric ward there as part of this facility, but there is no documentation for the entire island ever being a mental institution. There is also no recorded evidence of a doctor performing experiments on patients or dying by jumping from the lighthouse. Though there was not an asylum on Poveglia, there was another island that did have a large psychiatric hospital, and that was San Servolo. San Servolo is a small rectangular island just northeast of Poveglia and just south of Venice. It was originally a monastery, but in the 18th century it was turned into a military hospital, which took in its first psychiatric patients in 1725. It officially became a psychiatric facility in 1804, the Central Psychiatric Hospital of the Venice provinces, run by the monks of San Giovanni di Dio. At this time in the history of psychiatry, the invention of the asylum was relatively new. What was termed madness was usually dealt with at home, or those who were deemed mad were sent to prisons or workhouses. When these individuals were moved to specialized asylums, the idea was to use the blossoming field of medicine to treat them. However, these treatments were often very harmful. Physical restraint with chains, straitjackets, and ropes was not uncommon in most of these facilities, both in Europe and elsewhere. Asylums were also very crowded, due to the fact that people would send not just those suffering from mental illness to these facilities, but also violent criminals, vagrants, and women who did not act the way their male family members wanted them to. In the early 1900s, new so-called physical therapies were becoming popular in asylums, therapies such as using barbiturates to drug patients into a state of calm, insulin shock therapy, in which hypoglycemic coma was induced, and electroshock therapy, in which seizures were induced in a patient by repeatedly shocking them with electricity. In 1935, lobotomy was invented in Portugal, and soon the procedure spread all over Europe and was used most liberally in the United States. Also in the 1930s, during World War II, the Nazis instituted the forced sterilization and sometimes extermination of many of the mentally ill held in their facilities. They then used these asylums to hold their political prisoners, because saying the person was insane usually bypassed most of their rights. Italy resisted these measures, but still the patients that were held in most European asylums, Italy included, were not treated humanely, and this was likely the case at San Servolo as well. Patients were subject to restraint, starvation, and neglect. It's very likely lobotomy was also used. So while there was no specific record of a doctor torturing his patients at San Servolo, there is little doubt psychiatric patients across the world were undergoing treatments akin to torture. The facility at San Servolo closed in 1978 due to government-instituted reforms in psychiatric treatment called the Poveglia laws, calling for more humane treatment of the mentally ill. The site then became an institute for the study of social and cultural marginalization in order to preserve the history of what was done to the patients at the hospital. The island is now the site of Venice International University and includes a small museum about its time as a psychiatric asylum, Il Museo del Manicomio e l'Isola. The museum displays many of the instruments that were thought to treat patients, such as restraints, electroshock devices, hydrotherapy basins, as well as the arts and crafts made by the patients and some of their medical documents. The museum's website is both in English and Italian and encourages people to visit and learn from the mistakes of the past. It's very possible that San Servolo and all that happened there while it was a psychiatric facility became muddled with the history of the rest of the lagoon, and again, for some reason, Poveglia gets credit for the history of other islands from many online sources. This is, however, not supported by any historical documentation. It's my opinion that the reputation of Poveglia as haunted by the spirits of the plague victims and tortured mental patients has occurred for several reasons. One, because there are many islands around Venice, all of which play a part in its history. It's possible that because there are so many, all of their histories get mixed up in the fast-paced digital world we live in. Second, most of the documentation for the history of all the islands in the lagoon is in Italian, which makes the historical evidence inaccessible to most English speakers, making it difficult to quell the online rumors, as a large portion of the content on the internet is in English. However, there are many websites that can roughly translate these documents, as well as several scholarly articles and books on the subject that are in English, such as the 2012 book Plague Hospitals by Jane L. Stevens Crawshaw. It seems these rumors have not been put to rest thanks to a lack of in-depth research and the repetition of false reports. Third, there are visibly abandoned buildings on Poveglia, most of which are in a state of ruin. The island is also off-limits, and trespassing there is illegal. It's possible this no trespassing order made people wonder what could have happened there that made it off-limits, and a human's imagination always seems to jump to the macabre when abandoned buildings are involved. With the history of the surrounding islands being so grim, but the physical evidence of that history being hidden, or at least less visibly fascinating than the hulking ruins of Poveglia, it's possible Poveglia just felt more haunted, and therefore it swallowed up the history of the other islands to give that feeling some kind of basis. Despite the confusion, Poveglia still played a major role in the history of Venice, its dealings with the plague, and the health of its people. It was a refuge during several wars. It was used to protect the Venetian lagoon from invaders. It aided in preventing diseases from reaching Venice. And in its later years, it provided health care to the destitute. The healthcare facility on Poveglia was abandoned in 1968. The island has been abandoned ever since. Several proposals have been put forth on what to do with the island, but nothing has come to fruition. Many local teens in the 80s and 90s used the island as a party spot, a place they could hang out away from adults and local authorities. Graffiti and some damage to the structures on the island occurred during this time, but still the buildings held. Scaffolding was erected to keep the buildings standing at some point, but it too has been left abandoned. As to the rumor that fishermen won't go near the island, that is also not true. Fishing nets and cages have been noted all around the island and can sometimes be seen drying on the walls that surround it. In 2014, the island was auctioned off in an attempt to pay some of the national debt of Italy. There was a large amount of protest from local Venetians about the sale of the island to a private entity. An association called Poveglia per Tutti, or Poveglia for All, has raised awareness and formally protested against the sale. They have proposed the island be turned into a public park instead of another private and expensive resort. Poveglia for All raised the equivalent of $444,000 in order to bid for the island themselves, but were just under the winning bid of $513,000, which was placed by Luigi Brugnaro, then a businessman, now the mayor of Venice. However, Brugnaro lost interest in the island when he became mayor, and his bid was withdrawn. The government, hoping to receive more than both bids for the island, dropped the auction completely. Poveglia for All are still trying to use the funds they raised to turn Poveglia into a public space, but as of yet, nothing has happened that I could find. Poveglia and the web of stories that surround it have inspired books, films, and graphic novels. Several ghost hunting shows have also been filmed there. Unfortunately, the documented history does not support the grisly claims about Poveglia, but that history does exist elsewhere in the Venetian lagoon and elsewhere in the world. Why Poveglia has become an epicenter of these stories is unknown, and to me, that is the real mystery. Either way, I hope the truth has satisfied your curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and make sure to give us a rating on iTunes. Your ratings help us become more visible. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, and liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. People like Andrea, Tessa, Allison, Christina, Justin, Leanne, Karina, Mandy, Craig, Jen, Rebma, Fjolnir, Casey, Vanessa, and Lena. A huge thank you to Colette W., Aaron W., Karen K., Christina, and Robin, who have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon. Also, congratulations to Karen, who won the Fleet Street Meat Raffle prize this month. You too can be entered into this raffle by becoming a patron at the $1 level. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and articles, share your creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give a one-time donation by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. On our website, you'll also find links to all our social media, links to our sponsors, and other ways to contact us. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.